Okay, we now have two panels that both have a pocket that's closed up and the bottom of the pocket has been trimmed down. We are now going to make some marks on the right side of both panels that will indicate where the handle connectors go. So along this bottom edge, I'm going to line up my ruler with the side of the panel, and 1.5 inches away from the side of the panel, I'm going to make a little mark at the bottom of the panel, and then again 2.5 inches away from the side here. So I have two marks here, one at 1.5 inches and one at 2.5 inches. And then up here along this seam, I'm going to do 2.5 inches away from the side edge and make a mark. And then again, 3.5 inches away from that side edge and make a mark. So you can see here is how I'm measuring right at this seam that's been top stitched, and 2.5 inches away from this side edge and 3.5 inches away from this side edge. I put two marks here along the top edge of this pocket. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, and then I'm going to repeat all 8 of these marks on the other panel. Okay, both of our panels have all 8 marks, and it might be a little difficult to see here, but one thing to note is that the edge of the pocket liner, which you can kind of see here, you can see a little bit of the white on top of the pocket. The edge of the pocket liner ends in between my 2 marks. And I did that intentionally so that when you line up your connector in between these 2 marks, it's going to cover up that point where the pocket ends. So it's going to keep everything really nice and tidy because it'll be hidden away. So we're going to put these aside for now so that we can work on our handle connectors. Here are our 4 handle connectors again, and I'm going to turn these so that they are wrong side up. And I'm going to make sure that the stabilized end, which is also the end that has the top stitching, is all on the same side, because we are now going to measure 5 3/4 of an inch away from the unstabilized end, and we are going to make a mark across the wrong side. 5 3/4 of an inch. And I'm going to make a mark across all 4 handle connectors on the wrong side. That's 5 3/4 of an inch away from the unstabilized end. And you can see that mark here. So next I'm going to take my double-sided tape, and I'm going to just kind of estimate here. You want to put a piece of double-sided tape along the wrong side of the connector, about 1/2 inch or so away from the unstabilized end, and then run the double-sided tape along the center until it's about 1/2 inch past the mark you just made. So 1/2 inch away from the unstabilized end, just to keep the end clear so that any stitching we make along the bottom of the bag is not going to catch any double-sided tape. And then we extended it about 1/2 inch or so above the line right here so that we can add our hardware to this end and then fold the end down. So before I do that, I'm going to make sure all of these have the double-sided tape. And I'm going to slip my rectangle ring onto this end of the connectors. And then I'm going to remove the paper from the tape. Fold the top stitched end down to meet that line, and there's going to be that little bit of double-sided tape there on the other side of the line so that you can stick it down. Just like that. And then from the right side, you should still be able to see the line you made on the front and the top stitching on the front as well. So I'm going to do that to the other 3. And fold the ends down to meet that line. So here is one of our panels, and I'm going to take one of my connectors and I'm going to line up the end of the connector in between the two marks that I made at the bottom. Now the connector is going to stick down to the right side of the panel, but it's going to be at an angle, sort of like this. So the bottom of the connector, one side of the connector is going to hang down below the bottom of the panel. So I just like to line up the corner of the connector that's not hanging down below the bottom of the panel. I like to line that up with the bottom edge of the panel. So stick that down, and then the top of the connector is also going to go in between the top marks up here, and I'm going to stick the rest of the connector down, making sure everything is straight. So that connector is now stuck down, and I'm going to do the same thing on this side. I'm just going to grab one of my connectors. I'm going to line up the bottom in between those two marks and the top in between these two marks and stick that down nice and straight. And next what we're going to do is top stitch. So I'm going to start here at the bottom and I'm going to top stitch up the edge. And once I hit this line that we drew on the right side of the connector, it's the one that's about 1/2 inch below the top stitching here. I'm going to pivot at that line and sew across the connector and then down the other side. And I'm going to do that to both of these. And then I'm going to repeat sticking the other two connectors down to my other panel and top stitch those as well. So once I start approaching the part that's folded over, so it has a double layer of connector, I like to make sure that everything is still aligned and all the edges are straight with each other so that it's not hanging out from underneath the connector. And I'm going to pivot and sew across the connector and then pivot again and sew down this side. Okay, we now have two connectors that are completely top stitched and attached to the panel, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other panel. Okay, it is now time to make some measurements for our rivets, and we're going to put 2 rivets per connector. So what we're going to do is measure 1/4 inch above this bottom top stitching line. And that should put the rivet centered in between these two lines because these two lines should be about 1/2 inch apart. So if we measure 1/4 inch above this bottom top stitch line and then centered on the connector, I'm going to place a dot right there in the middle. There's my dot there, right in between these two lines of top stitching. And it's 1/4 inch above this bottom line of top stitching right here. And next we are going to measure 3/4 inch above this top line of top stitching. So it'll be about right here where we put the next dot, and it'll be again centered on the connector. 3/4 inch above that line. And there is that mark. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. 1/4 inch and centered. And 3/4 inch above the other line and centered. Okay. And next we're going to punch the holes for our rivets. And I use this hole punch. I just got it from Amazon. And I'm just going to punch the hole straight through and it kind of helps to kind of roll up the side so you can get in there. This hole punch doesn't have a very wide mouth, so it can be a little difficult to get into areas that are far away from the edge. So because for my hole punch, I have to kind of roll up the side of my material in order to get in to this dot, that can cause the hole that I punch in the connector to be misaligned with the hole that ends up on the panel. So what I'm going to actually do is punch the hole for the connector first. I'm just going to lift the connector up and punch this hole first. Okay. And then I'm going to take the point of my pen, put the connector down on the panel, and put the point of the pen through the hole that I just punched. So I make a mark on the panel right there. And that way my holes for my rivet won't be misaligned when I go to attach my rivet. And I'm just going to roll up the side here, get the connector out of the way, and then punch my hole through the main panel. Okay. I'm going to add my rivets. And then flip these over. Now you might want to stabilize your rivets. So if you have really long posts and they're sticking really far up from the back of your main panel, I make these little squares. I just cut out tiny, tiny little squares of Peltex and then punch holes in them. And then I add that to the back of my post of my rivet. And then I add the cap onto the back of that. And I also do this if I don't have stabilizer. So say I'm punching a hole through just vinyl and I need to add a rivet to that hole, there is a chance that the vinyl might stretch or the hole might become too large and the rivet will pull through. So in that case, I also will stabilize with Peltex, and that will keep your rivet from pulling through your hole if you have stretchy material. But for this one, my post is just the right size and I'm punching through stabilizer as well. So I'm not going to use the extra help from the Peltex this time, but I am going to add my caps to the back of my rivets, and then I'm going to go press these. Okay, those rivets are pressed, and I am now going to add rivets to this side and do the same, measuring my rivet markings and adding my rivets to the other panel as well. All my rivets are now pressed, and I have decided which panel I would like to be my front and which panel I would like to be the back of my bag. And now is a good time to add a custom label or a metal handmade tag or something if you choose to do so. I like to put mine 2 inches above the bottom of the panel, and also make sure that when you are cutting your holes for the prongs or the rivets, make sure that you're only going through the pocket panel exterior layer and not the liner pocket right here. So only cut your holes through the pocket panel. And I'm going to add my custom label right now. Okay, I've added my custom label here, 2 inches above the bottom, and another tip is to add duct tape to the back of any metal that is going to be up against cotton liner fabric, and that way the metal doesn't wear a hole in your pocket over time. So I just added some duct tape here to protect the liner from the prongs of my custom metal tag. We are now going to set both of these panels aside so that we can work on our side accents.